Hello and welcome to Majlis and Markets, a podcast where we explore the trends shaping Islamic and global markets. I am your host, Hassan Jivraj. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to leave us a rating. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Majlis and Markets, or drop me a line at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com. Today I'm joined by Yasmin al-Khwaiter, host of The Majlis, a podcast where she talks to global thought leaders about Saudi Arabia's economic transformation. With a background in consulting, Yasmin has worked both with private and public sector clients, giving her a unique perspective on the region. In this episode, we talk about the rise of content creators in Saudi, the rapid changes taking place in the kingdom, and what's next for its economy. Yasmin al-Khwaiter, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yasmin, you've got like a really interesting background, and mashallah, like your profile is really great as well. Like I'm an avid listener of your podcast, The Majlis, which is a fantastic podcast for all our listeners. It's an insight, I think, to or window into Saudi Arabia from a Saudi Arabian perspective. And I think you cover like really interesting topics as well. And obviously, it's in the English language, so there's no language barrier there. But before we get into all of that, Yasmin, could you give our listeners your early life and your background story?
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me, and thank you for the kind words about the podcast. I think we aim to accomplish very similar missions with our podcast, and it's lovely to be a guest on yours. Actually, the first time I'm on a podcast, so I'm super excited to do this. A little bit about me. I was born in the States, didn't spend a lot of time there as a child. I actually grew up between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, so a lot of my childhood was spent between Istanbul and the Eastern Province. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I'm actually Turkish on my mother's side, and it's heritage I'm extremely proud of, just as much as I am of being Saudi. But I think in terms of the knowledge gap that exists about countries, Saudi's is significantly wider. So I've devoted a lot of my energy to the space here. Growing up, I grew up in the Eastern Province in the Aramco compound, which is an expat compound that they would let some Saudis live in. And it really is like a tiny American suburb. So when people ask me, what was it like growing up in Saudi? I had a very privileged childhood there. Women were allowed to drive in there. You were allowed to wear shorts in there. So I grew up going to ballet classes, swim classes, all of that. But at the same time, I also went to a private Saudi high school outside of the compound. So I grew up between the two of you had to be covered up in school, and then you would come into the compound, and it was like you were entering a different world. And so that's how I spent most of my early childhood. And then for college, I opted to go to the States. So I ended up at Princeton University. I ended up studying history there, actually focusing on late Ottoman diplomacy and soft power. I found that super fascinating. And then in a completely unrelated turn, I started my career after graduating in consulting. So I graduated in 2020 into the COVID market, which was a tough time, but thankfully I had already signed my contract with the company beforehand. So I spent the years 2020 to 2024 working in management consulting, first in the US and then here now where I'm based in Riyadh and Dubai as well. Working with public sector clients, private sector clients, and really getting a feel for the kingdom and the opportunities in it, as well as the challenges. And last year, around this time, actually, I started getting particularly irritated with how the Saudi transformation was being viewed in Western media. And I realized the onus was also a little bit on us as Saudis to be better managers of our PR. And so taking matters into my own hands, I decided to start a podcast talking about the economic diversification of Saudi, from a Saudi to the rest of the world. And I've been running that for a couple of months now, and it's how I ended up where I am today.
Mashallah, that's really great and amazing. And like, I guess like living in the compound area, like, was it difficult going back to the US when you were in your college days?
The US is definitely a bit of a culture shock, because even though I was living with the amenities and the luxuries of an American lifestyle, I wasn't necessarily friends with many Americans. My friends were still firmly Saudi. And I think there are key cultural differences in the US. It's a much more individualistic lifestyle. We're much more community based here in Saudi. So there isn't that degree of closeness that you have generally in Saudi, I find. And I know this because, whenever Americans come here, the first thing they comment on is how warm and genial Saudis are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to Saudi Arabia first time in 2017 or 2016. So this was after King Salman ascended to the throne, and
Mhm.
I could just feel the changes that were happening. But you mentioned about the Majlis podcast. Maybe you could tell our listeners what exactly is the Majlis?
So the Majlis is an English language vodcast, so video enabled podcast on the economic diversification of Saudi. And it's done in interview format where I speak to CEOs, journalists, ambassadors, really anyone you can think of about the transformation in Saudi and how it's affecting different sectors. And what I really try to do with this is put it in the context of the history of Saudi. So we're not just talking about Saudi Arabia as if it began to exist in 2016. The kingdom is younger comparatively than a lot of other countries, but it still has a lot of history, and in particular, a lot of groundwork was laid in the past, 50 or so years that we don't want to lose to time and history. And so I really try to bring that to life when also talking about the changes happening now.
Interesting. So then why did you decide to do it in the English language or not in Arabic?
I think there is this is the number one comment I get, by the way. Whenever I release an episode, every single comment, not every single comment, but always one comment has to address the fact that it's in English, and they ask, why aren't you speaking in Arabic? Uh, there are many reasons for this. First of all, I believe that there is great content out there in Arabic on Saudi. I don't think I had a lot to add on to that market. I think people are filling that space in a great way. You can look at Thamania. All of their podcasts are in Arabic. A lot of them touch on some of the topics I'm touching on. So I didn't see a gap in that market. I do see a gap in the English language market in Saudi. There's very few podcasts in English, and I noticed that none of them were focused on tough economic topics the way I was. A lot of it is more lifestyle focused, advice, all of these things, which are enjoyable to listen to, but it's not filling the gap of economic investment, etc., knowledge that people are looking for. And I would also get comments from, I would meet, a lot of foreigners who would come to Saudi who really want to understand the kingdom in a deeper way. So not just, statistics and facts and press releases, but okay, what does the transformation look like in the day to day? What does it mean in practical terms? What happened 20 years ago that is causing what's happening today? All of these things people want to know, and there isn't an easily accessible way to get to it. And I myself find these conversations really interesting. And I would have these conversations before I started the podcast offline because I was blessed with having a very strong network of people I look up to. And I would ask them all these questions I have, and I would get it. And it seemed unfair to me that because I have these connections, I get to know all of this and other people don't get the chance. So it was really about democratizing this information and spreading it for whoever wants to hear it.
And who do you think you're trying to target? Are you trying to target like the Saudi millennials and Gen Zs, or are you trying to target the non-Saudi people like say the US or the UK or around the world?
In the beginning, it really began with a sort of, US, Europe, listen to what we have to say. This is actually what's happening in Saudi, not whatever you're reading online. But in a lot of ways, it's also, I think, hit home for the Saudi audience as well. A lot of them didn't know a lot of this history, particularly around the initial setup of a lot of these organizations. They also don't have access really to great content in English, or perhaps with the specific guests I bring on, don't usually do tons of media appearances. So it's access for everyone really, whoever wants to hear it. It began as almost, not to say propaganda, but really sort of almost press for the outside, and it's turned into a resource of sorts where, if I ended the podcast today, I can look back on these episodes as sort of a library of information on Saudi.
Why do you think Saudi Arabia gets like a negative image, in particularly in the Western media?
I think we don't have the US's PR manager. But in
Like
all
if you
seriousness,
compare it to somewhere like Dubai, for example, Dubai has very good PR and good,
yeah.
and even Qatar, you could argue as well. But it seems like Saudi Arabia doesn't get that much good publicity.
Well, I think we didn't feel the need to until recently. So, Dubai had to do what they did because they didn't have oil revenue. Uh, a lot of people might not know this, but Dubai itself doesn't have oil. Abu Dhabi has the oil. So Dubai had to sort of think of different ways to make money. And part of that was getting other people to come and spend it in Dubai. So it was necessary for it to seem like a welcoming, positive space to be. And they've succeeded immensely at that. Saudi, for a very long time, did not need to impress anyone. And we, I think, have not done ourselves favors by not showing off a lot of the incredible work that we do. I think we always get a bad rap year after year for incidents that happen during Hajj, but I firmly believe that there are, I don't believe that there are countries that could do a better job of it for the millions of people that come every year to have, one or two minor incidents a year or every 3 years is an incredible success. And the country pours ginormous amounts of money into that effort. Similarly, with King Abdullah, around 20 years ago now, a government scholarship was announced for university where myself and thousands of other students have been able to study in the US at no cost, no strings attached in the US or the UK. And the country doesn't expect anything back. They just expect you to. They just invest in the kingdom and its youth, and because of that, there is such a great love for the country among Saudis who end up coming back and working here regardless. But when you look at all of these efforts that the kingdom does, it's really a patriarchal state. It really cares for its people, and the bad rep that we get, I'll be honest with you, and I'll be honest with the listeners. Yes, there were practices that were, seen as archaic and not fit for the modern world. And this is something that Saudi's focused on changing. And it really, I think now is only a matter of time before, other people come around to Saudi. It takes time to let go of these notions where all they knew about Saudi previously was sort of the outlandish, archaic things that would come out of it. And now that there is so much more good happening, I'm very hopeful that it's just a matter of time before everyone sort of turns around and sees what's happening.
Yeah, that's really great. Before we get on to Saudi and Vision 2030 and thoughts on the economy, I just want to stick on this point about content creation, Yasmin. Like I was listening
Mm-hmm.
yesterday actually to what's it called, the Mo Show, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is a fantastic podcast, and it was talking actually to a Saudi influencer. And I've seen like over the past say 5 or 6 years, a lot of Saudi content creators come, and it was interesting. I think I told you I attended the 1 billion followers summit
Yep.
a couple of weeks ago, and I met a lot of people from Saudi Arabia. It was interesting. I met this guy, what's his face, John bin London, the English guy who has the Saudi accent.
Yes.
And also also from the investor perspective and from the distributor perspective. Why do you think, like, not just in Saudi Arabia, well in Saudi Arabia as well, but why do you think the content creation scene is flourishing at the moment in the region?
I don't think it's just a regional thing, by the way. I think it's really a global issue of people are looking for authenticity in the content that they consume. I think for a really long time with legacy media in particular, people feel that it's out of touch with them. And, perhaps Donald Trump's 2016 campaign of fake news has accelerated this belief that a lot of mass produced news is not authentic, not real, not true. So people want to hear from who they see as just, other fellow people. And while I think this is kind of a bit of a loss because, these people, these content creators cannot rival the financial teams, the education a lot of journalists have behind them at these outlets. I think it's inevitable that people will look for this authenticity in the digital age in particular. So I don't think it's a surprise, for example, that in the run up, in the final days to election day, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were both on podcasts of all things rather than in the hot seat at Bloomberg or the Financial Times. Similarly, in Saudi, I think you just see this, and in the region as a whole, you see this magnified because we have a much younger population and a more digitally native population. So, Saudi, the UAE regularly rank in the top 10 in the country in the world in terms of how many people are on are on smartphones on a daily basis. And we also, our population in Saudi specifically, I think 60 something percent is under the age of 35. So we're young, we're on our phones, we're on social media, and we want to learn from people who are like us.
Yeah, that's really great. I think, or like, it was interesting when I went to, like I mentioned, to Saudi in 2016, 2017. You saw, like, I saw people using Snapchat, and Twitter
Yeah.
was still used. I think that's still the case today. But if we talk about Saudi Arabia, I think since for our listeners, since 2016, when Saudi Vision 2030 was unveiled and it was announced. Well, to begin with, tell me, what do you think? How do you think the last 8 years have gone, or 9 years actually? Now we're in 2025, have gone in Saudi Arabia from your perspective?
I think it's gone incredibly well. In if you want to talk in financial terms, since 2016, Saudi has more than doubled its non-oil revenues, despite, by the way, volatile energy prices. So oil being at lows. Unemployment is now, I believe, at around 7.5, and the Vision 2030 goal is 7%. And we have a credible peg to the dollar, so inflation is kept low. We have an incredible pipeline of events that we've secured, whether that's the 2034 World Cup, 2030 World Expo, the Asian Winter Olympics, I believe 2027, all of these global massive events that are going to happen that ensure, a pipeline of very strong demand for infrastructure and supply in Saudi. So in that sense, we've done incredibly well. But really, more importantly to me is the successful sort of shift of the social contract. And this is something that's still ongoing. So I will not say that, we've done a great job and it's over. But if you can imagine taking, a rentier state that's extremely patriarchal, where most of the population is employed by the government in extremely cushy jobs, working very few hours and making reliable income, to going into a fast-paced environment where you're competing with migrant workers, with expats, all of this, the new generation, you really had to get them to sign on to this, because it isn't, in some ways, it's not an easier life. You have to work a lot harder and you have to prove yourself in order to make a living in a way that you didn't 25 years ago. But you can see how the social change has been done in a way that embraces the youth and brings them along on the journey rather than leaving them behind, so that everyone feels motivated to be a part of this change. And I think that's the biggest success story in Saudi. And that's why I don't really care when people are like, okay, well, how much of the line is going to be done in 2030? That is the least of my concerns. You've successfully taken Saudi from one end of rentier state to another. And one of the few countries, I think, in the 21st century, Arab countries in the 21st century, that hasn't had a major civil uprising. That's the success story.
I mean, Yasmin, from your perspective on a micro level, what changes have you noticed over the last 8 or 9 years?
For me, it's become, quite frankly, a place where I will now want to spend the rest of my life, which wasn't the case before, quite frankly. So I always thought, because I have the privilege of US citizenship and a life in Turkey as well, that once I was, done in Saudi, I wouldn't necessarily come back. I would just come back to visit family, because I didn't think that in a pre-2016 world, when I was still in high school, there was much of a life for me here. Like, women's employment was still massively limited. There were a lot of things that you couldn't do without the permission of your father. So you wouldn't be able to rent an apartment alone, leave the country alone, all of these things, which I didn't feel viscerally, because I come from, alhamdulillah, a very supportive family, but it was reality for a lot of women, which necessarily limited your upward progression in a career. But since the changes have happened, I really could not have cared less about staying in the States. I was working there for 2 years just because I thought the experience there was important. And all of my friends were telling me, "What are you doing in the US? This is a time to be in Saudi. Your lives are changing here. Every single day we're breaking records. This scale of change has never happened in history before." And so I'm back here. I take the metro to meetings. I start a podcast in a great studio. I immediately am supported by hundreds, thousands of people. It's electric, the energy here.
Do you think like Saudi Arabia wants to become like Dubai? Do you think Vision 2030, which started in 2016, do you think it wanted to become or emulate similar to Dubai, or that kind of?
I feel like you're testing me with this question. We No, I don't think we are the next Dubai, and nor would I want us to be. I don't think anyone wants to see another Dubai. First of all, it's just not physically possible, right? Because Dubai and Emiratis, the locals, make up 10% of the population, right? They're a tiny fraction of it. Saudis will always be, because we're just a much larger country with a much larger population, at least 50 to 60% of the population. So you can't really erase the local culture the way you see that happening in Dubai to make room for, Western culture. And that authenticity also is not something I think people want to lose. So no, we're not the next Dubai. We are Saudi Arabia. We invite you to be a part of our journey, and we will let you continue in your Western practices, but we're going to stay true to our values as well.
One of the things that was interesting to me, Yasmin, when I was reading Vision 2030 2016, was that home ownership was a big goal of Mohammed bin Salman, and I think it still is today. I mean, for a Saudi young person, how difficult is it to buy a property or to rent a property?
I think housing is definitely a hot topic, and it's something on a lot of people's minds. And there's a lot of work being done on the government side and on the private sector side to push housing. There's massive, massive demand for it right now. The supply is trying very hard to keep up. I do think, of course, it's not as easy as it was for our parents' generation, perhaps, but this is something that's true globally. Again, you see people in the U.S. struggling to buy houses wherever they are. There's a lot of projects, including subsidized housing, government projects that build housing that are not influenced by inflation, etc. It's not as easy as it was before, because simply before there was so much land in Saudi Arabia and it was so cheap to buy and to build with low migrant wages. This isn't necessarily the case anymore. Buying and building a house from scratch is not as obtainable for the youth, but I definitely think that mortgage rates are kind here, and the government is putting a lot of money into ensuring that youth can, at least if you put in the effort and you are saving your money, you'll be able to buy a house before you turn 60. The flag here, of course, is that also we have a very low savings and investment culture. This is something that's true throughout the GCC, because I think we're used to a patriarchal state, and people don't have a culture of, okay, I should save my money for a rainy day. There's a huge consumerism trend here. And that's what worries me, is that people aren't taking this into account and saving early on.
Yeah, one of your podcasts, which I really enjoyed, was I think you talked to this lady who was talking about Saudi investing, and for people in Saudi Arabia who need to be more invested in the markets and to save more and to create wealth. I think
Yes.
that's one of the interesting things, right? Is that the financial sector of Saudi Arabia is still quite, although it's growing, it's still quite nascent compared to, say, like other markets, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's a lot of exciting startups that are coming up in this space that are addressing precisely this issue. One startup that I've seen recently that I've enjoyed a lot is called Arwaid, where it's an app that lets you invest in both the Saudi and US stock market. And I think this is really the right approach to it, is because we're, again, a young and digitally native population. All of these startups that produce these apps for making saving and investment almost gamified, easily accessible, is the way to go. And I think that's going to slowly shift people's mindsets.
Yasmin, one thing that you mentioned is that the social contract. How
Mhm.
important is it for the social contract to be rewritten? Because you mentioned it like it's still in process. Like, how important is it for this social contract to be rewritten?
It's integral, it's critical to the continued existence of the Saudi state, I think, right? Because you need people to be on board with the government, and you need the government to be able to tap into the resources, which is its youth. So if people feel left behind on this mission, and they just give up essentially on being a part of Vision 2030, being part of the employed workforce, the country won't be able to accomplish what they want to accomplish, and these people will not be able to make a livelihood. And so Saudi gets a bad rep, I think, because some of the changes that happen aren't as fast as the US or Europe would want it to be. But you're really trying not to upset what is quite a delicate balance. I mean, you still have a lot of very religious folks here who are not always on board fully with a lot of the different changes that are happening here, including all of the concerts that happen, a lot of the events that happen, women's inclusion in the workforce. There are still quite a lot of people who are influential and not happy with these changes. So it's, part of making sure that the social contract succeeds in its shift is keeping that balance of slow, gradual change and making sure that the majority of the population is on board with it.
Yeah, I mean, like if when I'm just thinking back when I last visited Saudi Arabia in 2019, so obviously it's been a while. I remember going to a mall after a conference, and I went to a clothing store, and I talked to a young Saudi person there. Just got talking to him, and I was like asking him, "Do you think like the Saudi people are now going to be doing lower skilled or menial level jobs?" And he said, "Yeah, that this is happening. It's changing." Do you feel that this change is happening as well?
There's definitely more Saudis you see working in these sort of jobs that may have initially seemed beneath them before. So working in restaurants, working in clothing stores. Uh, it's an adoption that I thought wouldn't happen so quickly. So I'm really happy to see it. But although I don't know if this is out of necessity or if people genuinely believe in it, right? So that's one flag I would have. But I think the adoption of sort of things that we see as beneath us in Saudi, I've been always pleasantly surprised by. So recently, for example, the Riyadh metro finally opened after many months of delays, years of delays. And I assumed that people wouldn't want to go on it, but I've actually seen it full every single day because public transport is something that's quite new to us and maybe seen as too pedestrian, but that hasn't been the case.
And Yasmin, how open do you think Saudi is to foreigners? Like, this is a big topic. Like, and also like Mohammed bin Salman's been talking about this a lot in trying to attract foreign direct investment. Is Saudi Arabia open, for example, to non-religious tourism?
Saudi Arabia is, I don't think open is a strong enough word for how we are about non-religious tourism. I mean, we've already surpassed the 2030 goal we've set for non-religious tourism last year, and that's only projected to increase, right? Because as I mentioned, we have these huge global events coming up. We have new locations that are opening every few months. I mean, if you're thinking about it, we haven't even opened half of the tourism centric giga projects that are projected to open in the upcoming years. We've really had Al Ula as proof of concept, and now Sandala and Neom and a few of the Red Sea global resorts. But really, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I think it's great timing because tourism to non-conventional countries is skyrocketing. So, Americans have an appetite now to look further than Europe. Europe is overdone. The Indian middle class is getting wealthier. It's a 4-hour flight here. Really, I think, yeah, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, he put it best when he said tourism is the new oil. Saudi has some of the last beautiful untouched coasts in the world, and a culture that thrives on hospitality and generosity. And people want to see it. People love to see places that haven't been seen before. It's interesting because sometimes there's almost a bit of a disconnect. So I've had people tell me, I would love to visit Alula, but in a way where they're saying it as if it's a separate area from Saudi Arabia. The marketing is just that good for it, I guess. But once all of these locations are open and Saudi becomes a place where you can sort of, similar to Europe, where you just drive 2-3 hours and you're in a different country and you get to experience new things. That's what I imagine Saudi will be like. You can hop from the Red Sea to Neom, take a train down to Riyadh. All of these things I think will be incredible.
But this is catering to high level tourism, right? Like, because when I looked at the prices of like say staying in these new projects, it's still quite expensive to stay in these accommodations.
100%. I think the first phase of the projects are targeted towards luxury travelers. You have a lot of the private sector handling actually the middle sort of class hotels and resorts, and that's going to come online soon as well. So this isn't something that there is as much fanfare about because, again, I think going back to the Saudi and publication point, our PR point is we often talk too much about grandiose things and not about practical things. But there are a lot of hotels being built now in Al Ula, in Red Sea, that are going to be at a much more reasonable price point and that also include the private sector. And this also gets again into the point of, a lot of people gave Saudi flack last year because we extended timelines for a lot of projects. It's because, and the finance minister was talking about this at Davos as well last week, we are trying to prevent leakage. And, when we're building this much at once, we still don't want to lose money in the kingdom by importing a lot of the either the, project managers or the supply itself for the project. So by slowing it down and by letting local companies in on the business, we can build slower and more thoughtfully and be inclusive of more folks.
Yasmin, what would you say to somebody? I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about Saudi Arabia. He works for a company, a British company, and he was looking at expanding. And when I mentioned Saudi Arabia to him, he kind of groaned and was like, "It's still a very difficult place to do business." Beyond the headlines, he's saying it's still quite a difficult place to do business. I know Saudi Arabia has done things like the arbitration law and
Mm-hmm.
trying to normalize the business laws there. What would you say to somebody who's skeptical from a business perspective?
I think, first of all, I would want to understand how much time they've actually spent in Saudi, because I hear too much from, folks coming from outside who expect to get off the plane and, be handed $1 million, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but not really, because they really think there's almost a sense of entitlement to Saudi capital. And it's just not that easy is the truth of it. You do need to invest your time and your energy into building connections and building not necessarily a brand, but building credibility in Saudi Arabia in order to have access to Saudi funds. And I think a lot of people just don't want to put that in and groan and turn around when they realize it's not going to be as quick and easy as they want. That being said, I recognize that Saudi doesn't have, for example, what you have in Dubai of special economic zones, right? Where it's essentially British law, which makes, I think, a lot of foreign companies more comfortable investing in Dubai. You're still beholden to Saudi law here, which might get people worried about the potential implications if something goes wrong, which is something I understand. That's something, in CAFT, for example, the financial district in Riyadh, they are now working on incentive schemes and structures, and that should go a ways to make things better for folks. But in addition, I think we could use more attractive and more complex incentive schemes, frankly, for foreign businesses coming here. So we could be creating, I look at the Singapore example a lot. I think that's a successful one of how do you create tax breaks, tax benefits for productive sectors like innovation, like technology, to get those to come over here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things he mentioned to me was that the like the activity, a lot of the activity happening is being driven by the government, primarily through PIF. So he said it wasn't
Mhm.
organic private sector play. Do you agree with this like notion that it's very government driven?
I think the instructions are top down, right? So the kingdom has a very clear goal in mind of what they want to get done. But you, as the private sector, really all you need to do is, read up on what they want to get done, see where the gaps are in the market today, and then, put yourself in a place to be helpful to them, because it's not like they have all of the resources to do it all at once, right? So the most successful private sector players I see are the ones who are working hand in hand with the government to help them get this done. It's true, that it's not there are some KPIs that need to be filled. And if your project doesn't fit neatly into one of them, perhaps then it's harder to find backing. But there's so much that the kingdom wants to get done in every sector. I find it hard to believe that you wouldn't be able to find a niche for yourself in there. And the exciting thing about Saudi is a lot of these sectors are greenfield, right? So I've heard from, particularly deep tech investors who work in the US primarily, that it's tough in the US because you have a lot of lobbyists who are actually hell bent on keeping legacy technologies in place because that benefits them, right? Whereas in Saudi, you actually have the government saying, we want things to be as new and as, technologically advanced as possible. So again, you have the government on your side, which is not something to take lightly.
Yasmin, what do you think of this notion or this idea that a lot of this is debt driven as well? Because if you look at Saudi Arabia's debt levels over the past, say, 5 or 6 years, it's really skyrocketed, especially last year. I mean, PIF was borrowing, issuing a lot of bonds. They just secured a new credit facility, and some of the other companies as well have done a lot. Do you think, are you not worried as a Saudi citizen about the level of debt that's being accumulated by the government?
I don't think it's one to worry about. I don't think we're in um, a position of indebtedness that surpasses a country like the US or a lot of the EU. I think it's normal. We have strong GDP growth. Again, the currency is strong and stable. We need to be investing right now. This is critical. We're investing for our future. And we believe, you have to believe that we're going to be able to balance out the sheets eventually as the fruits of our labor starts coming in. But if you don't make this investment now, you risk a lot more in the future, I think.
Yeah, because like, I think if you look at the debt levels, I think Saudi Arabia is still quite low compared to other credit with a similar rating. It's still quite low
Yeah.
to GDP.
And this is why also we've made a lot of investments, and this is ongoing of looking really into the financial records and trimming the fat where it is. So a lot of again, last year, a lot of projects were not necessarily deprioritized, but scaled back because we've really, what we've done in the past few years has been more of a venture capital play. This is something that Hadi Shahabi said on my podcast that I think is a great metaphor for it. So we, put a small amount of money into a bunch of different sectors to see what stuck and what worked, right? And now as we move forward, as we mature, we're slowly refining that and cutting off some of them and investing more in some of them. And as we do that and we continue to calibrate, I think we'll be in strong standing. And the IMF has, lowered us very slightly in the ranking this year, but I don't think it's a cause for alarm at all.
What reforms would you like to see, or do you think are needed to help Saudi Arabia's economy for the next couple of years?
I think we need to have more refined taxation. So right now, a lot of the income for the government comes from the 15% VAT, which is all well and good, but I think that is too simple of a taxation, and we're leaving a lot of money on the table by not creating a better structure for it. So having more capital gains tax, more property taxes, more taxation on sort of these less productive sectors, and in fact, lower taxation on tech and innovation, as I mentioned before. So that would be helpful for us, I think, to get to a place where the government has more reliable revenues while also encouraging the growth of the economy. The other things I think is we need to keep in mind are female Saudi workers. So you've had a lot of Saudi women joining the workforce, again, surpassing our 2030 goals, which is incredible. But we need to keep in mind that women still need to be afforded that balance and flexibility to also be able to raise children, right? We don't want to go the way of the rest of the world where, birth rates are dropping so dramatically, the country is shrinking, the population is shrinking. Saudi's birth rate has already dropped, which is, to around, I think, 2 point something, which is still in line with going from, developing to developed. But we want to be careful to still give women that space in order to not go any further down.
Yeah. And then, Yasmin, the other question I had was obviously Donald Trump came into the office last week, and there was news of Saudi Arabia investing, I think, over $1 trillion or a pledge of $1 trillion. What do you think of the relationship now between the US and Saudi?
I think a lot of people think that, Saudi massively preferred Trump to come into office versus Harris, which is not necessarily the case. I think we've built up a great relationship with the Democrats in the past few years, and we would have continued to have great relations regardless. But of course, Trump has shown that he's an ally to the Saudis, and we're excited to have him in office, I think, to continue to build on this partnership. And so a lot of investment both ways, right? So the Saudis have always invested a lot of money in the US, and this will continue, and vice versa. I think now the US is, investing in Saudi, right? I mean, just when Trump was announced as the election winner, there was also announcements of, Trump Towers being built in Jeddah and Riyadh. So it's really it's a close relationship, and Ambassador Ratney is on his way out, unfortunately, but the rumors are, of course, that Trump will appoint a political appointee, a close friend, to really keep a close eye on this relationship. And I think it's one he prioritizes, and the feeling is very much mutual.
So when Donald Trump says he wants OPEC, by extension Saudi Arabia, to keep oil prices low, what do you say to that?
I think Saudi and OPEC by extension have usually not caved to international pressure when it comes to oil prices. This is something that affects all of the world, not just the US. So that's how they will be making that decision, I believe. Of course, not to say that Trump's words don't carry weight, but it's one part of a larger decision to be made.
Yeah, and the other thing we haven't also talked about is the rise of China. I think that's a really fascinating thing. Do you think there's going to be more Chinese investment coming to Saudi in light of Donald Trump?
I think Chinese investment would be coming here regardless. I think any country not working on their partnership with Saudi Arabia is not being very smart currently. Saudi's trying to be a professional ally to a lot of different countries, I think, which that was a bit of the tension with the Democratic Party previously, is that Saudi, was on good terms with China and with Russia. But when you look at, China being the biggest, their biggest customer, essentially the biggest importer of oil, and Russia being the second biggest exporter around, it really makes sense to keep them both close. So it's again, like an unreasonable request on the part of the Americans, I think, from Saudi. So I think expanding that relationship just beyond oil. I mean, you just had the DeepSeek tech come out and sort of shake the entire AI world in the US. You need to really keep everyone close, and I think Saudi does a great job of that, and I think we'll continue to.
Yeah, it's really, we need to watch this. Yasmin, as we bring the podcast to a close shortly, how do you see the future for content in the region?
I'm excited for the future of content in the region. I think people are really stepping up their game. So I'm hopeful to see more content creators who are focused not just on lifestyle, but rather really on history, on economics, on politics. You're really seeing a resurgence, I think, of a bit of intellectualism that podcasts are facilitating. So I always bemoan the fact that I think, people, particularly my age, are reading less and less. But I think if you're getting them to listen to podcasts where they're effectively learning the same sort of information, that's great. So that's what I'm excited about in terms of content creation, is more knowledge and more useful things rather than just doom scrolling.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask you as a content creator and as a podcaster is, do you think brands have recognized the importance of these new channels? Because from the 1 billion followers summit, it seemed to me like the brands still haven't got like hold of this or really understand how to utilize it.
I think brands know how to work with lifestyle influencers. So, it's easy if there's an influencer who's focused on, wearing makeup and clothes, and, brands naturally partner with them. I think we're still working out the kinks of this new type of content creator who's focused on knowledge creation, and how brands can effectively partner with them. And that's something I'm working on today, so how do we bring about this position of thought leadership, and how can brands be a part of it to position themselves as those who are sort of aware of the changes happening and are moving along with it. So this position of thought leadership that we see particularly in a lot of VCs and PEs in the US, I think we're going to see more of that in Saudi. I'm excited to see more think tanks, or not even just like smaller forms of professional organizations that contribute to knowledge creation in Saudi. I want to see all of that, and I want to see local brands and global brands sponsoring them to show their investment in this change.
Yasmin, where do you want to take the Majlis? Like, where do you want to go with this podcast?
That's such a great question. Thank you. I'll let you know when I figure it out. But for me, really, the goal is to create as much information as possible and to publish that, right? So I think Saudi has an incredible history that is being lost, as we're just now really in the past 10-20 years losing our grandfathers, our great grandparents, who were part of the foundation of the state. And so to me, this is history that needs to be recorded, that needs to be written down. And we need to go hand in hand when we look at the transformation in Saudi. We need the starting date not to be 2016, we need it to be 1933. So that's how I'm looking at it. That's all of the knowledge that I need to put out, and that's it's a pretty big onus. So that's how I'm working on it. And I'm every day I meet folks who have such an interesting story to tell, and that's really what I want to be able to broadcast. I mean, I was talking just yesterday with a Saudi fashion brand creator. His brand is called Qurmuz. It's quite famous, and he really wanted to just talk about the historical influence of his clothes. So whether that's inspired by the 1950s military dress that King Saud designed, or talking about how, traditionally people actually wore colorful thobes, not white thobes, because it would get too dirty in the desert. All of these things that really speak to the soft power of the kingdom, in addition to the hard facts of history. There's so much to be discussed and publicized. So that's really my goal.
A lot of catching up to do.
Yeah.
And Yasmin, tell us any projects other than the Majlis that you may be working on that you can share with our listeners.
Right now, I'm really focusing on growing the podcast, but what I would also love to do in the future is focus more on creating ancillary content. So what I want to do, as someone who reads a lot, is to start giving recommendations for folks on, what you need to be reading today to really understand the hot topics in the world, whether that's AI, whether that's market crashes. In addition to, giving more of my take on world events, on geopolitics, all of these. I think a lot of people are overwhelmed by the events happening around us, particularly in the Middle East, and rightfully so. Being able to make that knowledge accessible is really what I'm about. So I don't want to speak from a high horse from like a policy perspective. I want to sort of, in the language of the people, if you will, make sure that everyone has some level of base knowledge about what's happening around us today and can form their opinions on this.
And how can people watch or listen to the Majlis?
So the Majlis is available on all major streaming platforms, your Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. We're on YouTube as well. And finally, our social media is across TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. It's at the Majlis Pod.
Amazing. And are you yourself active on social media?
I am trying to be more active. So at Yasmin Al you can follow me. I will, we'll see if I hold myself to that and become more active on the Instagram space.
Inshallah. That's really great. Yasmin, this has been a really fantastic conversation. And I like I said before, I really enjoy your podcast, listening to it. And it's really a fantastic one. I really recommend all the listeners to listen to it or watch it. To continue following your journey.
Thank you so much. This has been such a joy and a privilege.
If you made it this far, you must have enjoyed that episode. If you did enjoy that episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us bring you more great insights. Follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram for the latest updates. Got feedback or guest suggestion? Email me at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com.